The US Army's 333rd Field Artillery Group arrived in Belgium in October 1944. They had previously been fighting in Normandy and Brittany. They were assigned to a quiet sector of the line, the village of Schoenberg, near Saint-Vith, Belgium, in an area of low mountains and forests called the Ardennes. Their job was fire support for the US 106th Infantry Division guarding the frontier with Germany. The 333rd was a racially segregated unit, meaning that its commanding officer and battery commanders were white, and junior officers, NCOs, and men African-American. The US Army remained segregated until 1948 in law and until 1953 in practice. This episode is brought to you by CuriosityStream, a subscription streaming service created by the founder of the Discovery Channel that offers thousands of documentaries and non-fiction titles from some of the world's best filmmakers, including exclusive originals. Like Adolf Hitler, The Itinerary, an immense study of Hitler's movements from childhood to the end of his life, and D-Day, Hidden Traces, that uses archaeology to uncover what was left behind in Normandy by Allied and Axis troops from helmets to bunkers. If you sign up between November the 16th and January the 3rd, you can get 25% off a yearly subscription. That's unlimited access for only $14.99 a year. So use the code MARKFELTON when you sign up and get 25% off your yearly subscription. CuriosityStream, the best streaming service for lovers of history. Activated as a so-called coloured unit in August 1942. In March 1943, the 333rd was reorganised as the 333rd Field Artillery Group. When we think of the Battle of the Bulge, we often forget that several of the US units involved were African-American, a point that has been largely written out of the story. Sadly for the 333rd, its African-American soldiers were to face Germany's most race-obsessed military force in combat, the Waffen-SS, with disastrous results for a group of artillerymen who fell into their hands. For they were on the receiving end of Germany's last big offensive in the West, the Ardennes offensive. Adolf Hitler planned to unleash his panzer and infantry forces through the forests in Belgium and Luxembourg and race for the Meuse River and the Allied supply port at Antwerp. If he could recapture it, supplies would be completely disrupted on the Western Front, and the US and British armies cut off from each other. Perhaps a negotiated peace settlement could be concluded in the West, leaving Hitler free to deal with the huge Soviet menace on the Eastern Front. The German High Command thought the plan was too ambitious, as Germany faced manpower and fuel shortages and had lost air superiority in the West. But in the wake of the bomb plot assassination attempt on Hitler in July 1944, few generals dared to oppose him. One of the reasons Hitler selected the Ardennes sector for his attack was because it was thinly held by US divisions that had been badly battered in the recent battle in the Hürtgen forest on the German border, or were green, inexperienced replacements. The success of the plan rested on bad weather to hide the German columns from Allied air power and rapid armoured thrusts to reach the Meuse River quickly before the Allies could counterattack in force. When the German attack broke on the morning of the 16th of December 1944, the 333rd's positions were around 11 miles behind the US front line, which was quickly pierced in several places as German infantry stormed across rivers to attack the widely scattered US infantry fort outposts. German artillery also hit the Schoenberg area. In an increasingly confused battle, the surprised Americans were soon facing powerful German tank columns that were bypassing the remaining surrounded infantry units at the front and advancing west with Volksgrenadiers close behind. The 333rd was ordered on the afternoon of the 16th to displace west to avoid possibly being directly assaulted. However, the commanding officer of the shattered 106th Infantry Division requested that C Battery and the Service Battery remain where it was to continue to provide fire support to the heavily pressed 106th Division's regiments and the nearby 14th Cavalry Group. These two batteries held their original positions all night, but time was running out. On the morning of the 17th of December, German panzers and infantry captured nearby Schönberg and the bridge that connected the village to Saint-Vite. Packing up, the two American batteries attempted to move. The service battery was shot up by German tanks and infantry. Those who were not killed were captured. The Germans moved these prisoners down their column out of the way of the advance. However, not all of the 333rd Artillerymen were prepared to give up the fight. A handful of men in the column decided to try and escape. During the confusion of a US air attack, 11 men managed to flee into the woods and evade the Germans. They were determined to reach US lines. Moving cross-country, by the afternoon the exhausted, cold, wet and hungry US soldiers approached the hamlet of Wereth, which consisted of just 9 houses. This was a mistake. Like many of the border communities on the Belgian-German frontier, at one time they had been part of Germany, and many of the inhabitants were of German ancestry. Some of the villagers of Wereth were such Germans who had welcomed the German army in 1940 and even had sons serving in the Wehrmacht in 1944. The 11 American soldiers took a chance and banged on the front door of the first house they came to. The owner, Matthias Lange, of German descent, was, however, a Belgian patriot, and he took the exhausted, hungry and cold Americans in. The unofficial leader of the group of 333rd Artillery evaders was Technical Sergeant James Aubrey Stewart. He spoke with Mr. Lange, asking for assistance so that they might warm up, dry their boots and clothing, and eat before moving on to US lines. The young GIs offered the Lange family any French and Belgian francs that they had on them, but Mr. Lange refused, happy to help them. However, not all of Lange's neighbors were as patriotic as he was. Unfortunately, the 11 desperate Americans had placed themselves in the path of the main spearheads that were attempting to reach the Meuse River quickly. One such was Kampfgruppe Piper, an armoured battle group commanded by SS Obersturmbannführer Jochen Piper, a highly decorated officer, the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, the senior Waffen-SS unit. Piper was impatiently smashing forward since the 16th of December, its leading Panther and Panzer IV tank companies and Panzer Grenadiers overcoming scattered US resistance via Lanzarat to Buchholz and then Honsfeld. At Honsfeld on the morning of the 17th of December, Kampfgruppe Piper had taken the Americans by surprise, taking a large number of prisoners along with masses of abandoned transport vehicles. Next, his spearhead deviated from the line of march and captured Bühlingen and a huge US fuel dump, enabling Piper to refuel his column before moving off towards Ligneville, smashing aside any US resistance on the way. In the vicinity of Beaunay, Kampfgruppe Piper attacked a US convoy from Battery B, 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, about 150 men in 30 vehicles that had just departed the village of Malmedy. After some confused fighting, most of the US column surrendered. The SS herded the GIs into a field. The main SS column now moved off towards Ligneville, leaving the Americans under guard. But at 2 p.m. shots rang out near the Beaunay crossroads, followed by machine gun fire. What happened remains a hot topic of debate even today. The Germans claimed that some of the US prisoners tried to run away and were fired on, resulting in all the prisoners trying to bolt, and the SS guards opened up indiscriminately. Some historians claim that young, immature and inexperienced SS troopers opened fire when they misread the situation, and this devolved into a war crime, with wounded GIs being finished off by SS men who had lost control of themselves. The widely discredited findings of the post-war Malmedy massacre trial claimed that the SS simply killed the prisoners without provocation. However, at other towns and villages where Kampfgruppe Peiper had earlier captured large numbers of US prisoners, these captives had been treated properly in accordance with the rules pertinent to POWs. What happened after the Malmedy massacre certainly points to a hardening of the attitude of the SS men to Allied prisoners. When Kampfgruppe Peiper took Ligneville, another 8 US prisoners were killed without provocation, and Belgian civilians in many of the towns captured by Peiper were mistreated or killed. Wereth lay slightly to the south of Kampfgruppe Peiper's push. It was in the vicinity of another battle group supporting Peiper's advance, Kampfgruppe Hansen, also of the LSSAH. For just over an hour, Technical Sergeant Stewart and his men enjoyed Mr. Langer's hospitality, but unknown to them or Langer, a neighbour had left Wereth to make contact with the SS column that stretched all the way back to the German border. This neighbour, a woman, had a son in the German army and was a loyal German. She made contact with elements of Kampfgruppe Hansen. Shortly afterwards, a Schwimmwagen jeep approached the Langers' home, containing 4 heavily armed SS Panzer Grenadiers. Technical Sergeant Stewart realized that resistance was hopeless. The 11 GIs only had 2 rifles and a handful of bullets between them, and primarily he didn't want to endanger the Langer family, which included several young children in the house. Stewart and his men filed out of the house with their hands up. They were forced to sit in the road under guard until sunset while the SS questioned the Langers. At about 7 p.m. on the 17th of December, the Langers last saw the GIs being herded off along the dark road. It appears from evidence discovered in February 1945 that Stewart and the 10 other soldiers were forced into a field 900 yards from Wereth. Examination showed that the 11 African Americans had been brutally murdered. Unlike the 85 Americans who were gunned down at Malmedy on the 17th of December, the 11 at Wereth had been tortured before being killed. All of the men had been severely beaten with rifle butts, with multiple broken bones, and had also been run over with the jeep and bayoneted in the eyes. Some had also been shot. The bodies had then been left in the field to be covered by falling snow. The US Army investigated this heinous crime for 2 years, but were never able to identify those SS that were responsible for the massacre. The crime remains unpunished to this day. Unlike the shootings of white American prisoners at Malmedy and a few other places by men of the 1st SS Panzer Division, the killings at Wereth were indicative of sadistic and premeditated assault, perhaps motivated by racism. The SS had a well-founded reputation for such atrocities on the Eastern Front against groups that they considered to be their race enemies. Another possible reason for the barbarity of the massacre at Wereth was the publicity the US Army had given to African-American military units, publicity the Germans were fully aware of. The 333rd had an excellent reputation for its fighting in Normandy and Brittany in 1944. Was the massacre simply a terrible vengeance against the foe the Germans did not respect and deeply despised? Unlike the Malmedy massacre, which was used by the US authorities to try and stiffen US Army units' resolve to fighting the war against the Germans, the Wereth massacre was declared top secret and buried, even after the full truth became known in February 1945. In 2004, a memorial to the Wereth 11 was dedicated on the Langer property, and the massacre finally entered the public consciousness. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and share, and also visit my new audiobook channel, War Stories with Mark Felton. You can also help to support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon, details in the description box below.